Hi everyone, welcome to week 35, and we are going to be talking about the path of war. This is part one of the virtual lesson for our very last Nearpod for World War II. All right, so we're going to be talking about the end of World War II and all the major battles that led up to the end of the war. And so this is part one, and we're going to be talking about more or less the European front. So here we go. All right, so before we actually get into the end, let's talk about the beginning. And so causes of World War II were many. Okay, there was the act of nationalism and totalitarian governments, and of course the Great Depression. This all led to really failed policies such as appeasement, and even Germany and Italy and Japan having very common ideas and goals of expansion, of reaching far more countries than they should, and also Germany and Japan's invasion of neighboring countries. And so, what did that lead to? And how did that actually become some of the more important reasons why World War II started? So, what do you think? Here, take a few minutes and give your opinion on what you think is the most important cause of World War II. And again, think back to, was it political, economical, or was it just ideological, meaning like how they thought? Okay, I'm going to pause the video for maybe a minute to write your answer. All right, so before we talk about some of the turning points in the war, let's talk about how it started. Germany actually attacks Poland, a neighboring country to the east of Germany, and this starts everyone declaring war. And in the very beginning, France declares war, Britain declares war, but they don't really do anything. They kind of sit around and they kind of wait on what Germany's going to do next. They don't even help Poland. And so they just kind of wait. And then Denmark and Norway are also conquered because Hitler himself isn't sitting idle. And their use of lightning war, blitzkrieg, is so effective. It is countries fall in a day. And then Germany turns attention towards France, and they start some major engagements. And the invasion of France becomes a full-out war. Britain deploys troops to France, and France is ill-suited to actually fight against Germany, and they eventually are kind of pushed back. They're pushed back so far that British and French troops are stuck in the northern part of France in a place called Dunkirk. They're stuck there because they have nowhere to go. They are either going to get trampled by the Germans going towards coming in from the east, or they're going to need to find a way to get out of wherever they're trapped. So hundreds and thousands of soldiers are trapped at the beach on Dunkirk. And this is actually where civilians and people with boats rescue a lot of these soldiers and take them to Britain, which is actually on an island. And so, because of the evacuation of the major infantry troops in Dunkirk, France falls. And France is taken over by Hitler. And you could actually see pictures of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower. He's like, hey, look, I've conquered France. And that's one of the major I guess, highlights of German occupation and German, expansion. And so from there, they set their sights on Britain because all the major European countries are pretty much in Hitler's grasp. Spain, okay, and nobody really talks about Spain. Spain is neutral, but neutral in a way that they are actually in Hitler's pocket. Spain is taken over by kind of a dictator. His name is Castro, and this person is also very he kind of overthrows the Spanish government, takes over as dictator, and befriends Hitler. And so Spain is pretty much out of the war. Portugal and I guess the Democratic Republic, I guess part of Spain, flees to Portugal, and they're pretty much living in solitude. Hitler, um, in many ways just is sharing similar thoughts to Spain and say, hey, I won't do anything with you if you just kind of share some of the ideology. And so they're pretty much not exactly allies, but Spain is considered neutral throughout the war, and they never really actually joined in World War II, obviously. And so the only place left is Britain, really Britain, because he's conquered most of the Norwegian countries. He's conquered the eastern country of Poland. Italy has the southern areas and is expanding into Africa. And so Hitler's like, what's left? Britain. And so they fight Britain. And it's the Battle of Britain that begins some of the major changes and even some of the turning points in the war. All right, so, what do you think is going to happen in this Battle of Britain? And also, think about this. Why has no modern warfare ever tried to attack Britain? Let's think back in history. Elizabeth the First. Spain tried to attack Elizabeth the First way back in the 17th century, and they were soundly destroyed. Okay, and so like, how did that happen? So Spain like actually created one of the largest navies ever, and they tried to go to Britain and take it over, but Elizabeth was actually very smart. She was able to kind of call together a bunch of ships, and these ships weren't really part of the British Navy. Some of them were pirates. Some of them were like you just like very wily like I guess sailors like Francis Drake, and so they were able to um, outsail the Spanish Navy and destroy them. And so in that way, Britain from that point on was like considered a little bit unconquerable. So in modern warfare, what do you think happened? This is the time of like, these huge metal battleships, not wood ships that could just burn, but like, like almost unsinkable battleships. So how did like, Britain, you know, um, just kind of defend itself when it comes to like any kind of, I guess, foreign invasion? Think about that. Okay. All right. Take another minute to think about why Britain has never been really attacked during the modern era. In the 19th century, why was Britain never attacked before this battle? All right, so the Battle of Britain. Ooh, here's the juicy stuff. So the Battle of Britain is a German air blitz on Britain, and the Luftwaffe were the German, I guess, air force, and they were very competent. They were a very extreme group of like it's German air force was supposed to be one of the best. Okay, course, they weren't as good as the British. And so the British were very strong in their naval abilities. Okay, they had great ships. But what about the Air Force? So they actually had to recruit heavily, and their Air Force became also very strong. They found recruits even like from other countries such as Canada, America. They all kind of went to Britain because they expected this. They expected the Germans to attack by air. But what happened was the Germans mostly bombed the cities, especially civilian populations, especially London. And because London was such a heavily industrial area, they thought that if they could just destroy London and conquer London, it would be the end of it, and the British would surrender. But they didn't. And one of the major reasons was uh, Winston Churchill. And we'll talk about him later. But Churchill did a great inspirational speech that really rallied a lot of the Londoners, but because of like this constant, because it wasn't just one bombing raid from the German Air Force, it was just for a whole year, they were just literally just pelting London, just trying to like, blow up bombs. And then there would be raids from I guess there would be a counterstrike from the British Air Force, and so air sirens, the woo sound would be very common, and people would be hiding in subways, in shelters, and a lot of kids would have been like moved away from like London to the countryside. And this is actually the premise of this very famous book called the Narnia books. The beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe starts in a World War II bombing raid where the kids have to like leave London. And said all six of these children. I'm not even sure they're actually exact. Well, they're supposed to be all siblings, but they leave and and they go to this distant relative's house where he has this weird wardrobe, and that's actually where where the book starts. And this setting kind of tells you a lot about like what's going on at that time. There's like a lot of uncertainty, the brink of war, and this awfulness of what war really represents. And so that's kind of the Battle of Britain. Okay, they call it the Blitz, and like every time it's just like the Luftwaffe coming and just like trying to destroy London. And so here's actually a picture of what a tube looks like, which is actually a subway tube that became a air raid shelter because they had to like flee quickly to underground and make sure that they don't get bombed. All right. So do you think it was okay though? Uh, the Germans and what they did to London during Total War about bombing big cities because don't forget that Americans and British air forces also did the same later on. So do you think that's morally okay? Like major cities, like bombing Berlin, bombing Tokyo, bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Do you think that's morally okay for either sides? Okay. And so the Royal Air Force, or the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, were a collection of men and they got really good at flying because they had to defend themselves against German raids, and there was a very limited amount of them, and it was constant. Whereas the Germans could actually, I guess, they could they could train new recruits. The Royal Air Force really didn't have that luxury because of constant bombardments from the Germans. And so British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he announced, and he really kind of over radio, he said, "We will fight over land, we will fight over sea." And no, and just like kind of really this whole idea how the British were never going to give up, and that the Royal Air Force were going to do their job and defend London. And so never was so much owed by so many to so few. So the propaganda for the idea of like the Royal Air Force, you can see the Royal Air Force right here, was very secure, and Churchill got them through this very very tough time, and eventually they did win. They defended Britain. It became too costly for the Germans to keep bombarding it, and eventually Germany turned its attention somewhere else. So think about the prime minister, okay? And who was the prime minister who played an important role in the Allies during the later part of World War II? So we do actually have a few prime ministers and prime ministers like the president of Britain. So we have like Neville St. Clair. We have Winston Churchill. There's also like FDR and all the other like presidents and prime ministers. But who was the one that really kind of got the Britons through their hard times, right? And so as Hitler turns his attention to other places, the uh, the Axis, meaning Italy uh, and mainly Italy and Germany, they focus on other areas such as North Africa. So Italy tries to expand further into the North Africa, and they also fight in the Balkans. Okay, the Balkans is actually the area a little bit closer to Turkey, but that's also where Bosnia and Serbia was or is during that time. And Hitler actually even makes, okay, well, since we're expanding towards the east, why don't we go all the way to the Soviet Union? And because of what Hitler does to the Soviet Union and Stalin, hey, didn't we have an agreement? So remember back, Stalin and Hitler in the very beginning said, hey, let's not have any kind of battle, non-aggression pact. Well, that goes out the door. So Hitler like isn't actually interested in non-aggression on the Soviet Union. So the Atlantic Charter is brought up, and the Atlantic Charter is actually a formal agreement of allies. Okay, and it's really like France, Britain at first, and then I guess the Soviet Union joins in, and even America joins into this charter. And it's actually kind of just an agreement of some of the things that they want to see after the war and also as allies. So the Allies' plan was concretely to actually look at Europe first. They wanted to deal with Europe first, and this was and so this is after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. America joins the war, and so they focus on Europe, and then they're going to focus on Japan afterwards. So Stalin wanted a second European front open, which is that kind of um, going towards Poland, and he just wants to like, attack, like right in the beginning. He wants the focus to be actually on Russia, obviously. But Churchill and the American president Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided, hey, like let's go through Africa, okay? And because Africa again is a weaker, I guess, front, and it's a little bit more spread out, and it's easier probably for the combined forces to take that on. And so, do you think the Allies' plan of two fronts to finish Europe's first is a good plan? So think about whether that focusing on Europe was a good idea for them. Was that a good idea or bad idea? So Africa, okay, was really Italy making a play for Egypt. Okay, Egypt was protected by Britain, and so Britain hammered. So Britain was the one to first kind of defend it. It's like, okay, well, we have to send our troops there. So Britain hammered the Italians, and the Italians were just they were awful. They were just nothing short of like incapable of going against British and Allied troops. And so 130,000 were actually captured. So the Germans like, all right, let's send in our guys. And so they send in one of their top commanders or top like generals, and that's Erwin Rommel. And Rommel is known as the Desert Fox. You know, anytime you have a nickname by your enemies, you're someone to be scared of. So the Desert Fox and his Africa troops really kind of keep the British and the Americans on the toes, not just for like a few battles, for a few years. So they're not able to kind of take back Africa because this guy is so wily and he actually understands how to like outsmart and outmaneuver his the American and British counterparts. So they set up another Operation Torch, and the British finally strike back at the Germans, and this is actually led by General Montgomery. And so they actually attack from the other side and kind of surprise the Germans in capturing North Africa. And so eventually, even despite having better leadership for North Africa, the Americans and the British finally win and finally push the Germans back out of North Africa. And it only takes 2 years. So which side of the war is argued that won in the North Africa theater? Okay, and don't think about which side actually won in this, because it's actually a little bit we're not too sure, but it is actually for other reasons why the Germans actually leave, but they actually do actually get pushed out of North Africa. All right, so the next major offensive, okay, for Hitler was Soviet Union. And so going towards Russia was probably one of Hitler's biggest mistakes. And that's the thing, many conquerors have made this mistake, such as Napoleon. So the Operation Barbarossa is actually Hitler's biggest mistake. And Barbarossa was the attack on major units, major cities of Russia. All right. So one of the biggest battles was actually a place called Stalingrad. We're going to get to that in a second. But this operation started in 41 in June, and it ended kind of quickly. During that time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and and they and some other major groups kind of signed a friendship treaty, which is called the Atlantic Charter. And they start with these ideas that are very similar to what will happen in at the end of World War One, which is Woodrow Wilson. So you remember Woodrow Wilson from World War One, and they were thinking about creating a kind of a community of nations where they could call together to be some sort of organization so that they could kind of talk about their differences and resolve things peacefully. And so this was actually borrowed from Woodrow Wilson's idea of the 14 points and also uh, kind of the starting something um, better than what the League of Nations has been doing up to this point, which wasn't really effective at all. And so they were looking to actually probably see the start or the beginning of what we now know as the United Nations. And so in 1942, and we're going to go chronologically, okay? But the Battle of Midway was one of the major Japanese offenses. Sorry, major battles of the Pacific Front, Pacific Theater, and this is June of 1942. So this was an air sea battle, and it was completely on the water. There was nowhere, there's no infantry because there was no land. And so this air sea battle between the U.S. and Japan in the Pacific was such a huge part because most of the American force of like I guess deployed forces at that time was actually involved in this battle of Midway. And so the Battle of Midway was uh, a point where the Americans could finally reach Japanese occupied territory, and they occupied several islands before even actually hitting Japan. And so it was actually a very close battle, and the Japanese were very confident that they were going to be able to win this, but because of like just American know-how and just like resources that the Americans had, they were able to pull through and not be defeated in this battle. Um, and it turned the tide. It really kind of changed everything and allowed the American forces to start island hopping or taking major bases in the Pacific so they can expand closer to Japan itself. And that's actually very important because imagine like, being stuck on the water and having nowhere to land. You eventually run out of supplies and food and fuel, and that's it. Okay, your machines are stuck in the water, and they're just target practice after that. And so they actually had to get to or reach the nearest island before they either had to turn back and try to refuel, or they're just sitting ducks. So this is actually where it was such a crucial point in the whole campaign of the Pacific. All right, so think about what I just said and answer this question. Take a few minutes, guys, to kind of think about this. All right, guys. So this is probably one of my favorite battles, but it's also one of the nastiest battles ever in history. Not just like in I guess in World War II. So the Battle of Stalingrad, and Stalingrad was actually renamed from Leningrad and actually used to be St. Petersburg, and so it was actually a very important place to Stalin because well, it has his name on it. You see, Stalingrad, okay, it just means like Stalin City, and so Battle of Stalingrad was a major, major, major battle and a turning point for the Russians, and I'm going to tell you why. Okay, so the Germans wanted to take a very industrial city, and Stalingrad was a very industrial city, and they needed an area where they can actually transport resources, and this was the city because it had access to a river, and this river ran right into the city. So if they control the air, they can control also the sea, meaning that they could allow any ships they want to go into this river. So it was a very strategic spot for the Germans. Okay, and it was also Soviets were really under resourced. They didn't have enough bullets. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough anything. And so in the beginning, there was actually several battles of Stalingrad. It wasn't just one; it was several battles, and this battle went on for a year. Okay, it was a year battle. Look at the time frame. It went from August the 42 to about February. Well, it wasn't exactly a year, but it was about 6 months, 7 months. It was really, really long for one battle, just one. And the Soviets pretty much refused to give up the city. And here's the reason why. Stalin said, "No one steps backward." Okay, not one step backward. not one. And meaning that if you would to retreat from the city, you would be executed for treason. Okay, Stalin was that merciless. Okay, he really wanted people to hold the city, and he forced them to literally by gunpoint. And so it actually worked because civilians, soldiers, they refused to give up, and eventually they were able to counterattack the Germans, and they were able to surround them. And mainly, one of the most famous reasons for this was snipers. Okay, so the Russians, for some reason, just had a little bit better, like snipers, possibly. And so there's actually even a story about a very famous Russian sniper. His name is Vasilius Zasili, and he was able to kind of take down major officials, major snipers of the German force. And Hitler refused to let the general surrender this town, so he lost a huge amount of Germans eventually to this. And the body count is huge on this. I mean, about 70 million people died in all in I guess in the war, and about 2 million of that is from just this one battle. Okay, and that's like a pretty big percentage of that. If you do the math, that's about 5% of, like, of the total amount. That's pretty crazy. So it actually ranks up there as one of the bloodiest battles ever in history. Okay, and even and the whole point of this city was so that the Germans could get a foothold in Russia, and then they could actually have a base of operations. They never got there. They never got there. They tried to fly in supplies, that failed, and eventually they lost this battle just because people didn't want to give up. And so you can see that number counts here. Okay, so it was a pretty big amount. I mean, geez, the Soviets were just throwing bodies at this. Okay, so look at these numbers. Like, even just within the Russian numbers, that was about, like, a million, 1,050,000. Yeah, that's close to a little bit over a million. And even though the Germans only lost like maybe like 600,000 killed or wounded, but still, that is actually a big number when you put the totals together. That's close to 2 million. And so the next major offensive after this came in 1944. Because Stalingrad was such a success, the Russians were able to push more towards the west, towards Germany. Okay, and so the next major offensive came from the British and the Americans, which is the attack at Normandy in France, also known most famously as D-Day. If you watched actually the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, that is D-Day. That is them storming the beaches of Normandy, and that is a awful, awful scene. Okay, so don't go watching Red Saving Private Ryan. It's rated R. There's a lot of gore in it, but this is actually one of the parts of what Normandy was like. And so Erwin Rommel, one of the highest like generals of the German of Germany, was supposed to be in charge of that area of Normandy. He wasn't there. So it really made a difference in why this offensive was so successful, even though there were actually a great amount of casualties. Okay, so D-Day is actually Juneau, Utah, Omaha, Sword, and Gold. So that was the code names for where they were supposed to be landing, and it was just a meat grinder, guys, a meat grinder. And think about, like, storming these beaches, and you were the first ones off, and the Germans had their bunkers dug, and they had their, like, their machine guns ready, and they were just trained on these boats landing. It was again just like a meat grinder, meaning that there were a lot of people that were hurt and killed, and there was major casualties. Okay, but it was a multiple front, and it was a huge operation. It was one of the largest ever, I guess, U.S. deployments in history. So tons and tons of troops were dropped into Nazi occupied France, and this is like an actual picture. I mean, this looks very similar to the movie we were just talking about, right? So some of I think I showed this scene to some of my students, and so just imagine, like, getting off of this, and then there's the bunkers are right here, and they're just shooting at you guys. They're just plowing away at these bulkheads of these like deploy boats. It's really just crazy. So 3,000 Americans died just on that first day, and it was not a small amount of soldiers lost. And so there's a memorial at Normandy because of the loss of life and what the American and British soldiers had to do to, to take that beach, which was not easy and probably the scariest thing that anybody ever have to go through. All right, so guess why D-Day was such a significant turning point in the European theater? And just think about that. Like the landing of troops into a Nazi-occupied territory, how does that make a difference? Because the Germans were pretty well fortified. They were pretty much okay. Let's build bunkers. Let's like have machine guns. Let's have everything manned and ready. They knew like exactly how to kind of defend their area, but they still lost that beach that day. So why was that such a big turning point in the scheme of things? So explain your answer, guys. Take a few minutes. All right. And then after this battle, this D-Day, this landing of American troops, over 1.4 million Allied troops arrived in France within the month. And so once they secure that area, you can see that boom, they were just deploying in droves. They were just getting a bunch of people in there. They were just dropping them in, and it was a major force. Okay, and just think about just how many troops the Germans had. It wasn't like somewhere in the millions from this point on. Well, they had a good amount, but they really couldn't count on any of the Axis allies. See what happened with Italy and Africa. So it was pretty a major step for them. So the Allies attack, and by 1944, Paris is freed. By September, most of the nearby countries, such as the Netherlands, and that's where Amsterdam is, and Belgium, which is right next to France. I'm not sure if Belgium was, freed after Netherlands, which doesn't make sense. But yeah, they were all neighboring countries to France, and they were really quickly very happy to see the end of their occupation. Okay, so the next major battle, and one of the last, was the Battle of the Bulge. And so the Allies were going towards Germany from probably the Andean forest, which is actually, I believe, is in Belgium. So the Andean forest was actually kind of in the mountains, and it was snow. It was actually a very tricky point to maneuver, and so the Germans were thinking about breaking the line, going through that area, and getting behind the Allies so that they could surround them. And so for their one, like they were going for their knockout punch. But and because of how it was defended, and they wanted to create a bulge so that they could get through the Allied lines, and then it would be a trickier fight for the Allies. But the Allies didn't break, and the Allies held the position. They were able to keep the Germans from destroying, I guess, a vital weakness or area in their kind of line, and it was the last major offensive by Germany. From that point on, there was no major battle that the Germans could even come close to winning. And so in May 8th, 1945, May 8th, which is actually today that I'm recording this. Okay, so happy V-Day, guys. Happy V-Day. That's actually today, May 8th, 1945, was the day that the war ended in Europe. So are you surprised that World War II ended in Europe before the Pacific? Yes or no, guys? And just think about that. All right, so we're going to stop there, and our next video is going to talk about our victory in the Pacific. And so thank you for watching. Make sure you kind of go through this Nearpod as you're watching this lecture video. It's actually to your benefit. Okay, I'll see you guys in part 2.